नदी की भांति बहती भाषा जो देश, समाज और संस्कृति की पहचान बनी, सदियों के इतिहास की साक्षी रही। वो भाषा विश्व में देश की पहचान बनी। कवियों, लेखकों से लेकर डिजिटल दुनिया तक परचम लहराया वो हिंद की हिंदी भारत की शान बनी। आइए आज मनाएं मिलकर हिंदी उत्सव, अपनी भाषा का, अपने सपनों का। हिंदी है हम।
We are delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth, India. It is our pleasure to present today 10 Myths About Israel, Ilan Pappé in conversation with Max Rodenbeck. Ilan Pappé is considered one of Israel's most groundbreaking, outspoken, and incisive historians and thinkers. His book, 10 Myths About Israel, examines contested ideas that comprise the discourse of the contemporary state of Israel, the oppression of the Palestinian people, and their struggle for liberation. Published on the 50th anniversary of the occupation, it explains why the two-state solution is no longer a viable option. Pappé is also the author of the Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, The Idea of Israel, and two projects with Noam Chomsky, On Palestine and Gaza in Crisis. In conversation with the journalist and South Asia Bureau Chief for the Economist magazine, Max Rodenbeck, Pappé discusses his work and the truth behind the Israeli-Palestine conflict, worsening each day. Ilan Pappé is an Israeli historian and director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. Pappé has written 20 books so far, among them The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine and On Palestine with Noam Chomsky. His latest book is The Biggest Prison on Earth, a history of the occupied territories. Max Rodenbeck is a journalist, critic, and writer on global affairs. Before his current post as South Asia Bureau Chief for The Economist, based in Delhi, he spent 30 years in the Middle East, covering wars and revolutions from Iran to Morocco. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comment section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag at Jaipur Litfest. Ladies and gentlemen, 10 Myths About Israel, Ilan Pappé in conversation with Max Rodenbeck.
Dr. Pappé, it's such a pleasure to be able to talk to you. I've been an admirer of yours for many years, and I've been looking forward to this. If I may, I'd like to start with the simplest things, which is to speak about your own past, your own childhood. You were born in Israel in 1954. Can you tell us something about your childhood, who your parents were? I understand they were originally from Germany. What did they do? Can you tell us about your childhood?
Definitely. First of all, nice to meet you, Max. Finally, not in person, but at least I can see you, which is great, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation. Yes, I was born in Israel. That is 6 years after the state of Israel was established, and both my parents came from Germany in the 1930s, managing to escape Germany at the very early years of the Nazi takeover of Germany. I had what one might call a very conventional and typical Israeli Jewish upbringing up to the end of high school, which would mean not a lot of contact with any Arab or Palestinian people, mostly kind of an isolated Israeli Jewish kind of upbringing, indoctrinated in a way which leads you directly to the military service, which is compulsory in Israel. So I would say that the childhood itself was very much like that of other Israelis, who were born or were the first generation of parents who came from either Western Europe or Eastern Europe.
And your parents arrived in Israel in the 1930s before the war, or was it after the war that they arrived in Israel?
Before the war, that 1933 and 1934, I think they both of them kind of realized that things in Germany are not going in the right direction, so to speak.
Well, yeah, to put it mildly.
Put it mildly, yes.
And,
to put it mildly, yeah.
And then you grew up. Were you a city kid? Did you grow up in Tel Aviv, or were you also
in Haifa?
Some distant? In Haifa.
No. I grew up in Haifa, which is the northern harbor town of Palestine, later Israel, which, as I noted, although it was a much more mixed town compared to Tel Aviv, where there were hardly any Palestinians, and nonetheless, it was quite a segregated kind of situation. The Jews lived on the top of the mountain. The Palestinians lived in downtown Haifa. So as far as my childhood was concerned and boyhood, I had little contact with the non-Jewish population, so to speak, in the city of Haifa.
And then you did your military service, and that was actually during one of the wars, no? Your
yes,
service.
That's right. Yes, I was drafted to the army in 1972, which meant that I participated in the 1973 October War. I was on the Golan Heights during that war. And immediately, which is also very typical to Israeli Jews, after the military service, I went to the university and slowly began a journey, which I'm sure we'll talk about, where outside the warm embrace, I would say, of the tribe, so to speak, I belong to.
And your war service, it was, I mean, the 73 war was a fairly short war, but on the Golan Heights, at least, it was pretty tough. I mean, with tank battles, it was quite I mean, did you actually see serious action at that time?
Not too much, but I did see enough to make me a pacifist in many ways. It was ugly enough and bloody enough to leave a mark. But it's still, in those days, I was still convinced that, these were necessary wars, that I was defending a homeland and so on. Which I suppose made it easier, but it's once you doubt the logic behind these wars and so on, it's a different story altogether. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so I have two questions actually. The first is, when you went to university, the Hebrew University to begin with in Jerusalem.
Yeah, in Jerusalem, that's right.
And why did you choose history, or did you choose history immediately? I mean, was that when you started off right away?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was not the best of pupils during high school. I didn't invest too much in that. But there were two topics which were really close to my heart. History. So I really loved history in school already. I, from the age of 11 or 12, I remember reading mainly history books. And secondly, I fell in love with the language of Arabic, which was not compulsory, but I chose it. I found it interesting. And the combination of loving the language and the history, and obviously, naturally, one is interested in one's own history before a general history, maybe. The conclusion was quite obvious that I would go to a department of Middle Eastern history, which, my Arabic became an asset, and also included the part of the world into which I was born and wanted to know more about. So that's why I decided. So it was not, they used to have a department of general history, which I did not enroll into. And they had a department of Middle Eastern history, which is the one that, I suppose in those days, they used to call it Oriental Studies, but we're much more careful about the term Orientalism, and rightly so, I should say, nowadays, yeah.
And was your academic career one of the continuous trajectory? You got your bachelor's degree and went on to a master's degree and went on to a PhD. I mean, did you just continue straight through? You were
No,
determined to be a historian,
yeah.
and
That's where the story becomes a bit more, I hope, more interesting. I finished my BA with good marks, and a family member of mine in Britain and some of the professors said to me, "Why don't you continue your studies abroad?" And I took the decision to kind of skip the next postgraduate studies in Israel and do them abroad, which really changed my life, I should say. I didn't know that it would change my life. I mean, I thought of very typical to aspiring Israeli academics are encouraged to finish their postgraduate studies abroad. You know, they don't like that much homegrown academics. So it gives you a very good chance for a good career if your degree comes from a good university abroad. So I choose, because of family connections and so on, I found myself in Oxford eventually. And I decided that I want something different from what I have in Israel, and I chose an Arab supervisor. And he was one of the leading historians of the Middle East, the late Albert Hourani, who was a Lebanese,
yes,
but nonetheless someone who was very much involved with Palestine. In the 1940s, he represented the Palestinians in many international venues. And that kind of meeting with, first of all, an Arab person, an Arab scholar, an Arab mentor, really changed my life, and it also impacted my choice of what to do in the doctoral dissertation. And from then on, it became this kind of clash between what I believed in and what I was indoctrinated about. Not immediately; these are always trajectories that take time, and they have stations and so on. But definitely, it was not a common academic career in that respect, because I chose to confront head on what was the basic truisms and mythologies, if you want, of my own society.
When did your sort of doubts begin? Was it a sudden moment? No, I suppose, as you say, it's probably more gradual. But I mean, at what stage? Even younger, when you were in the army? I mean, when did you begin to have questions about the whole the sort of narrative, the heroic narrative of Israel?
I don't think I could have done it while I was there. I think while you're there, it's very difficult to cast doubts about anything. So I think it really happened in Oxford. And it happened not just because I was in Oxford, not only because I was working with Albert Hourani and another excellent scholar, Roger Owen. I decided to look at 1948, the most formative year in the history both of Israel and in Palestine. And yet that decision was not political. I mean, I knew that there was no new material being declassified in Britain and in Israel, so it was also a reasonable academic choice to look at 1948. But I think the clash with what I was kind of brought upon was first of all through the documentation, through the finding in the archives. It really confronted and negated much of what I knew, what I was taught about, and you have to remember, I was already a history student, so I knew quite a lot about my own country's history, but I didn't know anything about 48 until I really looked at the archives.
And some of these archives began to be opened up only in the 1980s. Is that correct?
Both Israel and Britain had a 30-year rule of secrecy. So actually they were open in 1978, but I only reached them in 1981, 1982. So they were already open for 4 years, but nobody noticed them. Interestingly enough, nobody bothered to look at them, and nobody thought that maybe they have something in them that might be quite explosive. Not for a Palestinian, a Palestinian refugee knew that they were refugees in 48. Yes. And those who were still alive and remember what happened to them in 48 knew whether they were expelled by force or no. But for an Israeli Jew, there was a certain narrative about why Palestinians became refugees, what really happened in 48 in Palestine. And all this could not be substantiated really by what I found in the archives.
But you in your several books, including this one, which is perhaps your best known book, you've very thoroughly documented and substantiated a lot of the story of what happened in 1948, and in a way that really contradicts the Israeli sort of official version of things. But when you went back to Israel, did you expect that this would be a shock, controversial? Some of your research, which had begun to expose things like this Operation Dalit, for example, which was a kind of ethnic cleansing program that had started off even before 48. I mean, did you have any idea that you would eventually become a sort of bête noire in Israel? Were you expecting that to have pushback and resistance and even opprobrium from Israeli society to your research?
Not immediately, I must say. I was naively believing that I really believed in Israeli democracy, if you want, so to speak, and freedom of expression. In fact, my supervisor, Albert Hourani, warned me that I would have tough time, and I said, oh, he doesn't know Israel, and that's why he's saying that. And when I went back to begin with, it wasn't bad at all. First of all, I was not the only one. There was a group of us that in the late 1980s, we were called the New Historians of Israel. So there were other Israeli historians, for obvious reasons, saying the same things, because the material in the archive was very straightforward. It was not, we were not using deconstructive, sophisticated analysis. It was black and white, the massive expulsion, the intended expulsion, and so on. And for a while, and maybe we were lucky in a way, there was a certain period from the late 1980s, I would say, until the end of the 20th century, around 2000, when there was a relative openness in Israeli academia to hear different views, partly because kind of a peace process began with the Palestinians, culminated in the 1993 Oslo Accord between the PLO and Israel. But even before that, people were willing to hear some more critical views. I think the first Lebanon War of 1982 contributed to it. Many Israelis thought it was a no choice. It was a choice war, rather. And that made people think about other wars as well. So the atmosphere was not that hostile, I should say, until 2000. And I didn't feel public enemy, if you want. Everything changed in 2000 in a very quick a way, which kind of historically, even today, I'm still trying to digest how quickly these things can change. When the second uprising, the second intifada, erupted in the occupied Palestinian territories in October 2000, many of my colleagues who shared my critical view as academics did a U-turn, retracted their criticism, accepting the idea that now Israel is at war with the Palestinians again, and this is not time, for criticism. It's almost like you walk with a group of people, and you suddenly look to the left and you look to the right, and you're alone. And that's what I felt. And by 2001, I was really totally isolated as the only historian in Israel who insisted that something bad was done to the Palestinians by the Israelis in 1948, that the Israelis continue to do these things. And the moment I decided to define it with a clear notion of ethnic cleansing, that was too much for my own academic community. And it was, and now I understand that I was doomed to be expelled eventually from the university. It took some time because I started talking about it in 2001 and so on. But by 2006, I had to leave, and I couldn't work until today. I cannot work in any Israeli university. But I was thinking that this was a natural progression through what we found in the 1980s. I didn't realize that after 2000, the society lost its tolerance and actually saw as treason any attempt to substantiate or validate Palestinian claims of what happened in 1948.
there's a kind of irony there, isn't there? As the truth basically about what happened in 1948 and came forward, actually instead of responding to the truth to moderate, national image, on the contrary, Israeli political spectrum has shifted further and further to the right, further towards denial,
Yeah,
which is peculiar.
it is peculiar, and we need few hours, I think, to explain the what shall I call it, the Israeli mindset or psyche between what we call left in Israel and the right wing. People think about the right and left usually as people who have different socioeconomic ideologies, socialism versus capitalism. This is not relevant to Israel. When we talk about the left in Israel, this is a certain liberal Zionist point of view that somehow hopes that Zionist ideology and universal values of democracy and liberalism do not clash. And the right wing are those who say we don't need democratic and liberal values. What matters are national ideologies. So what was very curious is that the left wing in Israel saw my books and my exposure as something that they cannot accept and try to portray me as a liar, as someone who cheats and denied what I found. The right wing, which came to power in 2000 and is still there in Israel and dominating Israeli politics, said, yes, you're right, but you should justify it instead of negating it. So it's very two different attitudes. The academia that expelled me was not a right-wing academia. It was the liberal Zionist academia that expelled me. The right wing, actually, I always find it much easier, by the way, to talk to Israelis who are right-wingers. I totally disagree with them, but there's an honesty between us. They think you are a soft person. You're talking about liberalism and democracy. We don't have the license to have it because we are fighting for life and death. I don't agree with them. At least I understand what they're saying. The liberal Zionists say to me, you're wrong. We are democratic and universal and Zionist. They are kind of progressive colonizers and liberal ethnic cleansers. And this is an impossible position to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I suppose what you're saying is that for the right wing, you may be saying you committed, or Israel committed war crimes, and their answer to that is, so what?
Exactly.
Whereas the left wing pretend it didn't happen and would rather just close the chapter, I suppose.
Exactly.
And it's, but it's interesting that the emergence of these archives at the end of the 1970s, that's one kind of evidence. But there have been other scholars who got punished for their revelations. And there's this famous case of one of your, I believe it was one of your colleagues in Haifa, this Professor Katz, who did some research into a massacre during the Liberation War at a village called Tantura on the coast. And he was pilloried for this. He really suffered for producing his work on this. It was his thesis, I think, that he worked on. And you were one of the few academics in Israel to come out in his defense. And he really paid with his career for that, I think. But only just a couple of months ago, a film came out by an Israeli documentary filmmaker, which went through some of the same material and reproduces his own, Katz's own recordings of interviews with Israeli officers and so on who had been in the operation, and it seems to completely vindicate this view. Were you at all surprised by that?
Let me just correct one thing. He's not a professor. He was an MA student, and even his MA was taken away from him because of that. Yes, he wrote an MA dissertation in the late 1990s, and he exposed that massacre in the village of Tantura, 30 kilometers south of Haifa. And he based the strongest evidence he had was the evidence of the perpetrators of the massacres themselves, not just the the survivors, but also the perpetrators, which were Israeli soldiers. And under pressure of their peers in the university, they denied the evidence that they gave to him and even sued him for libel in court. And he broke down for a moment, admitted fabricating, which he didn't, evidence. Then he retracted his confession, but it was too late, and the university disqualified him. And as you say, he paid very dearly. He had 2 strokes, and this once very energetic person is today sitting on a wheelchair, totally incapacitated. But the film that an Israeli filmmaker did went back to these very soldiers in their 90s, on their deathbed, I suppose, so to speak. And they confessed that their early evidence about the massacre was the true version of events. And they also confessed that they were pressured to change their evidence. And also the judge took a different view on the trial of Katz and said, had I known that these people were lying, of course, my verdict would have been. So some justice is being done to this poor former student, Theodore Katz. So that's good. I think that most Israelis are still would find it hard to accept that this shows that my own work is correct and the truth is on our side. It will take much more than that, but it is important. It is important to reopen all the time in Israel, the discussion on the past, because in many ways, the ideology that produced massacres like Tantura and ethnic cleansing like 1948 is still the hegemonic ideology of the state of Israel and is behind the most inhuman Israeli policies toward the Palestinians today, wherever they are, whether they are in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, inside Israel, or in refugee camps. So it's much more than just telling the truth of what happened in 48. It's, confronting morally and courageously a certain ideology that has a lot of positives in it, because it saved, like my parents, it saved a lot of Jews from anti-Semitism, but it's also the ideology that serves for the dispossession of the Palestinians, the colonization, their oppression, and the brutal treatment by the Israelis. And this needs to change if we ever are going to have a peace and reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians.
Of course, our right-wing friends would argue, on the contrary, that maybe you were right, morally correct, but this, the Zionist project, Israel, is a success story. It's a success. It's become a very rich country. Perhaps it oppresses the Palestinian, not a pretty picture, but it's quite nice to be an Israeli right now. You're on top of things, and it's a wealthy, successful country. Can you argue back against the argument of the success?
Yeah, definitely. There are 2 ways of looking at it. One is, Israel is the only country in the world that I know that has a special ministry that its main assignment is to prove to people around the world that Israel is a legitimate state. Now, if you are the one who keeps trying to persuade me that I am legitimate, it means that I have a problem. I mean, otherwise, why India doesn't go in, the foreign Indian ministry doesn't have to prove in Washington that India is a legitimate state. That's not the issue of India, but this is the issue of Israel. Now, the reason it is exactly the contradiction between the success and the price that the Palestinians paid for this success. I think even the Israelis themselves understand that with all these achievements, there is a moral basis, there is an immoral, rather, basis for this success, which will make a lot of people continuing to question the legitimacy of the state, if not the state itself, the legitimacy of the regime in the state, and would continue to support, as so many people around the world do, the Palestinian liberation struggle. So that's one way of looking at it. And secondly, I think the proximity between Tel Aviv, the major Israeli city, and the Gaza Strip which are just 20 kilometers. The distance between them is 20 kilometers, shows you exactly why this success is only part of the story. On the one hand, you have this high-tech city, groovy city, very open city, by the way, with not one Palestinian Israeli living in it. Of course, it's a very racist city as well. And 20 kilometers from there, 2 million people are sieged now for more than now 13, 14, 15 years, denied basic food, water resources, freedom of movement, occasionally are being assaulted from the air in a far more massive, by the way, firepower than the Ukrainians are now exposed to the Russians. And
Sure.
of course,
Sure.
I don't condone that, but they suffered much more and so on. And this is Israel as well. I mean, the Gaza ghetto and the Tel Aviv ghetto, which is a different kind of a ghetto,
Sure.
are what Israel is all about. So it's a very questionable success. And
could I ask? Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, please. I just want to say, you cannot be an alien force in the Arab world, and you cannot continue to alienate the Arab world. White South Africa tried to do it, to deny that it was in Africa. And we know what happened there. The same would happen to Israel. The only question is, will the Israelis be willing to be part of a peaceful change, or will they wait until someone will be powerful enough to do it, unfortunately, in a bloody way? I hope that the first option is the one we're going to choose in order to make Israel organic part of the Arab world, and the Arab world accepting the idea of a Jewish presence of that kind in its midst.
Very good. Yeah, I think we're getting close to the end. I just want to. I presume that, judging from what you say, you would agree with these latest reports. Both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, sort of the world's two sort of leading human rights advocacy organizations, have both come out with reports which say that Israel basically its policies are akin to apartheid. I presume you would agree with that.
I do, and I think Amnesty International report is particularly important in two ways, very briefly. One is it's the first report that says we frame Israel as an apartheid state, not as a polemic issue, not as a political position. They say very clearly in this long report of theirs that it's based on recent scholarship, which is very important, I think, and may lead to a constructive conversation with the Israelis. So it's not people who hate Jews or hate Israel. These are people who sort of study things. Amnesty has a very good record among many of us as a very serious organization. And if they reach that position, clearly there is no vile agenda behind it, but just a clear agenda of human rights and civil rights. The second thing I would say, Amnesty's report also tells you of a different future that can be there. I mean, the antithesis to an apartheid state is a democratic state for all. So unlike what the Israeli government tries to say to its own citizens, if we don't maintain this apartheid state, we will be on a suicidal track. That is not true. We can replace the apartheid state with a democratic state, with equality for everyone, with a sharing on an equal basis, this country, which is a beautiful country and a rich country, sacred to so many people around the world, and turn it into a genuinely success story, not the one we have now. I think people should also look at this report and think about, with all the problems that still exist in post-apartheid South Africa, that there are options of creating, of rectifying evils of the past and creating a far more egalitarian and hopeful future for everyone who lives there and used to live there. Of course, those refugees who would want to come back should be able to do so as part of a liberated vision and a democratic vision for the future.
That's a very noble vision. But is it realistic?
Well, activists like myself, if we will just be based our activism on realism, we would sit at home and do nothing. We would just succumb to the balance of power. I think it's realistic in the sense that a lot of people believe in it. The Palestinian society is one of the youngest in the world. 50% of all the Palestinians are under 18. I think they believe in it. I believe in it. Will I see it happening in my lifetime? I don't think so. But I do believe it will happen eventually. And I think that one of the important thing is to make sure that people still work for it rather than sort of waiting for it to unfold naturally. It won't. You need to be proactive on this. So I never ask myself about this question about realism. I just ask myself, can I see any change in the number of people who join us in this endeavor and the number of people who are persuaded by this vision? And the answer is very positive. More and more people, even among the Jewish society in Israel, begin to talk about this kind of a vision. I'm not underestimating the fact that the majority of the Jews in Israel still do not subscribe to this issue. But Max, I was in South Africa after the fall of apartheid. Every white person I met in South Africa told me that they were against the apartheid. And I said, well, if all of you were against the apartheid, why did it last for so long? I envision a situation where Israelis eventually would deny their own stubbornness in the future. I'm a very hopeful person. But I'm realistic in the sense that I'm very fearful of the near future and possible bloodshed and so on. So it's not a rosy picture, but it is one that will sometime unfold, I'm sure.
I wish you were right. I'm afraid that our talk is taking place at a time when Russian tanks are rolling towards Kiev in Ukraine, and this seems to be underlining. If there's a new world order or a future world order, it just seems to be more of the might is right kind of world. So I wish you were right, but I fear that you may not be.
Yeah, we'll see. It's up to us. I think civil societies around the world are not represented, not only in Russia, also in the West. They are not fully represented by their political elites. We are led by quite cynical political elites who care a little bit more about their own interests than our interests as society, not just on issues of sovereignty and occupation, but also on issues of health and ecology and poverty. If we as human beings are going to give up on this, we are doomed to a very dark future, even before ecology would take over. So I think that we cannot leave such a message to our younger generation by saying, might, power is the only thing that matters, and there are no moral consideration. We need to be exposing hypocrisies. Even the Western reaction against and rightly condemning the Russian invasion includes so much hypocrisy. We never saw it when Britain and America occupied Iraq. We didn't see that when Israel bombed the Gaza Strip. We see that Europe treats European refugees very differently from non-European refugees. I think these are the faculties we need to expose this cynicism, hypocrisy, and then we can build, I think, on these foundations a much better society. But if we kind of believe that there's only one just system on the West, and everything which is not Western is not just, it's a global intersectionality kind of view on injustice in your own locality and injustice elsewhere is a good platform to work on, without losing your realism, but also without losing your optimism, I would say.
Dr. Pappé, thank you so much. I think our time is up. It was my pleasure listening to you, and I do hope your sound moral sense does, prevail over some of the silliness we're seeing in the world these days. Anyway, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilan Pappé and Max Rodenbeck, for this insightful session on the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us this series of exciting sessions and the JLF Writer Shorts that have been specially curated for you.